It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. Richard Strier is Frank L. Salzburger Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in the English Department, the Divinity School, and the College of the University of Chicago. He taught there for 40 years until his semi-retirement. His classes included Renaissance poetry, Shakespeare, Milton, Renaissance intellectual history, and literary theory. His published books include Love Known, Theology and Experience in George Herbert's Poetry, Resistant Structures, Particularity, Radicalism, and Renaissance Texts, The Unrepentant Renaissance from Petrarch to Shakespeare to Milton, and more recently, Shakespearean Issues, Agency, Skepticism, and Other Puzzles. Richard, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
I'm happy to be here.
You describe your published work as being similar to your teaching style when you were teaching in the lecture halls of the university, which I'm assuming is part of your overall philosophy of learning and education. But you say it brings together two approaches to literature that you say have been needlessly separated and seen as antagonistic, that of formalism and historicism. And I would like to begin our conversation, if you could please explain to the listeners a little bit about what that actually means.
I'd be happy to do that. It partly has to do with the history of institutionalized English literature studies in the Anglo-American world. The dominant methodology in literary studies from about the 30s through the 1950s. And we're talking about a field that really only got established at the turn of the 20th century. Before that, literature in the vernacular was not considered serious. You had to go to the classics to do serious literary study. But the way literary study really got established in the universities was through what we now call close reading. And the theorist of this was I.A. Richards in England, and then it was picked up by the so-called new critics in the United States. And this was an insistence on the internal integrity of literary texts, and the model, of course, was lyric poetry, although to some extent Shakespeare as well. And the idea was that you worked within the text, and the text told you everything you need to know about it. And the idea was just to have as careful and thorough an encounter with the individual work of art as possible, and to appreciate it as a freestanding work of art, so to speak. And this was a very useful approach for getting literary studies institutionalized, since it didn't require vast amounts of knowledge on the part of the student. It was especially useful after World War II, when in America you had the GI Bill, and lots of people were going to college, more than ever before. And it was a way of teaching literature that could immediately work in the classroom and would get students engaged, and worked, as I said, without the students in question having a giant background in literary culture. And this was all well and good, and techniques were developed for doing this kind of close reading, paying attention to metaphorical passages, et cetera, and how metaphors connected to one another, and how syntax worked, and how line breaks worked, and there was a way of aesthetic appreciation for literary studies. All well and good. But meanwhile, there are the folks who think, wait a minute, you actually have to know something to appreciate literary text. And this idea of the text in itself, and this was the great cry of the new critics, the text in itself, for itself, by itself, was kind of a weird thing, and that really, literary studies should involve knowing traditions, knowing historical background, knowing when a poem or work was written, et cetera, et cetera. And for reasons that are sort of mysterious, but have to do with the way literary criticism was in English departments were institutionalized, these became antagonistic. And the people who were partisans of close reading were saying, no, you guys are just dry scholars and you don't understand the beauties of literary appreciation. And the other people are saying, no, you can't really understand anything. You're deceiving yourself in thinking that you can understand works all by themselves, so to speak. Now, what seemed obvious to me, and I think is now obvious to a number of people in the field, is that this was a silly opposition, and that clearly what you want ideally is to do all the appreciative things that the new critics did and appreciate the formal beauties of a text, but also know something about when it was written, the tradition it was written in, because poets, writers know themselves to be situated in traditions and time periods, et cetera. So, but it took a while for these things to be really brought together, and there were a number of books that would try to do so, where you'd have part one background and part two application. So it's sort of bringing the two together in the sense that they're coming together under one cover, and you're sort of applying the stuff in the first part to the second part, but they're still kind of existing separately. And it seemed to me important in my first book, the book on George Herbert's poetry and theology, was to do the two things together. To, as I was considering the individual poems, to put them under topics that made historical and theological sense, so that I'm bringing in the material from the background, so to speak, in the foreground of the analysis. So there's no background and foreground contrast.
So let me get this straight. Basically, you don't have to, if I'm hearing you correctly, what I'm hearing you say is it doesn't have to be one or the other, but the combination of the two is a good marriage and is equally important. Is that basically the gist?
That's right. And the idea is that this was a separation that never made any sense. I mean, anyone with any just sort of common sense would understand, well, of course you want to appreciate the beauty of the thing and appreciate its writing, etc. But of course, literary works are written in traditions. An epic poem knows it's an epic poem. And of course, they're written in particular time periods. So, I mean, if there's a great poem by Andrew Marvell about the execution of the king in England in 1649. And there's no way of reading that poem in a sensible way without knowing that it's about something that actually happened and knowing something about how it happened. So, but still, there was this difficulty in the professional world of getting this, what seemed like an obvious couple, to marry each other properly. And I've seen it as sort of my task, and a number of people are with me in this, to try to bring these things together and say they never should have been separated in the first place.
Could it be argued that Shakespeare sort of helped contribute to this conflict, in that the traditional biography of the author is so full of holes, and we really know so little about the man from Stratford other than legal documents, court proceedings, and that type of a thing? And so did that sort of contribute to the idea that, well, you don't actually need to know much about the author or his life or the circumstances he existed in to be able to dive into the works and enjoy them as works of literature? Could we argue that Shakespeare particularly helped contribute to this separation?
Well, I think that's a good point. I think there's something to that. And obviously, reading major Shakespeare plays uh, is a great thing to do, whether you know anything about the period or not. And you certainly get a lot out of it. And yes, so that there's a way in which um, uh, Shakespeare seemed like a good case for formalist close reading because you got so much out of it. And then, as you said, just sort of parenthetically, we don't have a lot of information we would like to have in terms of background to Shakespeare. We don't know exactly his religious position, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Somebody's
yes,
calling.
so
Hello.
I think this was part of it.
So you sort of make an argument against the knowing in advance aspect of that, right? And then
Yes.
you focus
Yes.
on sort of opposing the historical framework, especially of the Renaissance. But I'm trying to understand where the shift occurs from, okay, I can dive into a text and I can enjoy it without any background, just as a piece of work. But then when I add in the context, the history, maybe even the autobiography or the biographical information of the author, suddenly I feel like, to me, that enriches everything further. I always like to use Edgar Allan Poe as an example. You could read the works of Poe and appreciate them, and wow, macabre poetry, and especially, we're just coming out of the Halloween season. But when we read about his loss and his tragedy and the suffering that he went through, I think we suddenly have a greater understanding for the personal pain that is being demonstrated through the work. Is that a good example?
That's I think, a reasonable case. I remember one of my favorite critics, a critic named William Empson, who wrote a famous book called Seven Types of Ambiguity in the early 30s. Um, is often thought of as a formalist, as a new critic, because he was so interested in ambiguity, and this is one of the favorite terms of the formalist. This is a pun, or this word can mean this and that, many things. But Empson was the first person to say, but of course you also need to know things. And I remember Empson giving a talk at the Modern Language Association convention saying, it really helps in understanding Keats's odes to know that the guy was dying of tuberculosis at the time he was writing them. And so that when he talks about, mortal suffering, he means something. So yes, the problem that I was addressing with the knowing in advance is a certain kind of uh, problem with historical understanding. That one trouble with people who know a lot about a period or a tradition or whatnot is they will often think, we'll look briefly at a work and say, oh, I know what it has to be doing because it's one of those. It fits into this tradition. Or this person has this or that religious tradition, and they must be doing X or Y. And my feeling is, I have nothing against, as I've said, knowing stuff, but I very much have a strong sense that we start with the text, that let the text tell you where you need to explore. So that, if Poe tells you that there's a machine of a certain kind that does something, well, maybe you want to look around and see, was there a machine that did that in the period? And what could he be talking about? And so there's very much, and I think that it's very important to be surprised by text, because I think the great literary texts are often doing things that are surprising and then one couldn't absolutely predict. And the trouble with knowing a lot sometimes is you can't be surprised. You say everything is, oh, yes, I recognize that. And I think that's a terrible state to be in. In a way, it's enviable because you know a lot, and you're always, serenely confident that you know what's going on. On the other hand, I don't think it's that great to be serenely confident all the time. And so my ideal is something like knowing a lot, but kind of putting it in suspension, that you don't know, that at any particular moment, you don't know what's going to be called. It's like a good conversation. That people in a good conversation have whole lives to draw on, but you don't know at any particular moment what's going to come up, what you should draw on in your experience, et cetera. And I think so very much, so in this sort of marriage of historicism and formalism that I'm interested in, I want the historicist to, in a way, let the formalist take the lead, to be reading the text until you get to the point where you say, oh, wait a minute, I don't understand this. This is puzzling. This seems to contradict that. Or what does this word mean? Or what is this a reference to? And then at that point, you bring in knowledge, but at that point, it's relevant knowledge. And it's knowledge that the text is asking you to bring in. And I have a strong kind of theoretical defense of the notion that texts call for things. Now, obviously, they don't. The book just sits there on your desk. It doesn't call out to you and say, Steve, you got to look this word up. But on the other hand,
come read me right now.
Right. But on the other hand, when you get to Hamlet making a speech about resisting fortune's buffets, you might think, what does that mean? And then at that point, someone who knows some intellectual history will say, well, look, this is a very standard way of articulating the ideal of Stoic philosophy, a sort of one kind of philosophy developed in the ancient world that was revived and very popular in the Renaissance. So it's at that point that you bring in your knowledge of Stoicism. But the text is telling you, well, by using a phrase like that, it's sort of signaling to you, on my metaphor, it's calling out to you and saying, think Stoicism. So it's that kind of thing.
You mean he's not cautioning us to not overeat by resisting fortune's buffets?
No, I'm afraid that's a slight misreading. I think the Stoics would want you to resist fortune's buffets as well as fortune's buffets. But I think in context, buffet means something like being hit. But yes, they would certainly want you to modulating your appetite was a big Stoic theme, actually. But it's not actually what that passage is about.
Of course. Well, you how have you found this to be received? I know from your work and from reading your CV that you're a firm believer in collaborative scholarship, and you've co-taught courses with other English professors, philosophers, yes, and a number of different historians. Even co-edited collections of essays with other literary scholars, historians, and then most recently one on Shakespeare and the law. We'll talk about a little bit later. But how do you, when you're in those collaborations, do you find colleagues who are in agreement? Is there opposition? What has been sort of the trajectory of this throughout the evolution of it?
Well, that is a great question. And collaborative teaching is tricky. It's a wonderful thing because, one is at a university, filled with smart people who do things other than what you do, but who might be of help to you. I have to give the University of Chicago some credit for encouraging interdisciplinary work. Although, again, even at the University of Chicago, it was sometimes administratively difficult, who gets credit for the course, who gets paid for what, that kind of thing gets in the way. Mm-hmm. But the university has sort of allowed us to get around those administrative difficulties to a large extent. But it means doing a lot of advanced planning with the other person. But in the most successful, and I can't say all of my co-teaching experiences have been total successes. It's every time you do it, it's an experiment. It's not like going out on a date. It's a little more serious than that. but you don't know exactly how it's going to work out.
The courtship is a really important part of it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the courtship and the it's like a good marriage. You want to be in continuous communication. You don't want to just have a good conversation, on the honeymoon and then never talk to each other again. When it works best, first of all, it's clear what the roles are. So my understanding of interdisciplinarity is that it only works if there's disciplinary difference to start with. That if everybody does the same thing, there's no interdisciplinarity, there's nothing to inter. It's just the same thing. So the courses that have worked best with historians or philosophers have been when the historian acts like a historian and the philosopher acts like a philosopher, rather than everybody trying to do the same thing. And what that means is that the two disciplines have to be able to show what they do, what their own power is, and put themselves together in the way we were talking about before, with that ultimately you want it to come together. So that I had a wonderful course with a Tudor Stuart historian who is a colleague on 17th century literature, culture, and politics. And when we, for instance, did Shakespeare's The Tempest, he was very interested in thinking about what does it mean that this play was written in 1611? What was going on in England in 1611? What was going on that's relevant to this play? And it turns out that the play is using some materials about a shipwreck that in a venture bankrolled by the Virginia Company, trying to set up and reinforce Jamestown in Virginia. And Shakespeare somehow got hold of this unpublished manuscript about this unfortunate shipwreck where these people never quite got to Jamestown, were shipwrecked in Bermuda, and used this in the play. And my colleague was really very interested. Well, he was interested in the question, how did Shakespeare get hold of this thing? It wasn't in print. Who did he have to know? What does it mean that he knew people who were the supporters of the Virginia Company, et cetera? So, and that just folded right into themes in the play about colonialism and domination and relying on indigenous people to help you survive in an unfamiliar landscape, et cetera. So, I mean, that was a perfect case where my colleague and buddy Steve Pincus, provided material that I didn't know, had never really thought hard about how Shakespeare got hold of this manuscript. It wasn't a problem that even occurred to me until Steve brought it up and showed how interesting it was. And then we were able to fold it back into the interpretation of the play, so that you have both things going on. The play has its place in a historical moment, and the historical moment sort of illuminates the play. And so, I mean, that's what it looks like when it really works. When it doesn't work, you have sort of two different lectures going on. So the historian gives his lecture on the history, and the English professor does his reading, and you have it's like the bad old days of historicism versus formalism, where you're sort of enacting that split in the classroom. So again, you can see that by working especially with historians, I'm trying to do the same thing that I was trying to do in literary criticism, is bring these materials into fruitful interaction. But dealing with actual human beings.
In your book, Shakespearean Issues, you have an entire suite on The Tempest,
yes.
Sort of a 3-part section in chapter 6. And one of the things that you touch on that I found very interesting is something that I don't think is really talked about a lot with regards to that play. And you point out that obviously the whole colonialism, Prospero being seen as sort of the usurper of the island, enslaving Caliban and forcing Ariel to his service, are certainly concepts and themes that are discussed a lot, particularly today. right now, poor Shakespeare is, sort of being labeled the old white guy patriarch who used everyone to his advantage type of a thing. But you point out, I think very astutely, that he seems to have throughout the canon this sort of love-hate relationship with service and servitude of any kind. And you argue that he grows more and more insistent through his work that servants need to resist the commands of masters, or perhaps even the command of royalty or monarchy, if there is an understanding within the loyalist, the servant, the subject, as it were, that the command in itself is immoral or is against God or against nature or whatever the philosophy or belief system is, right?
Yes. Now, this was a very hot issue in the period, and it's something that I really got into most when I started working hard on the play King Lear, where something happens that would have been utterly astonishing to the Elizabethan or Jacobean audience. It's written very early in James's reign, so it's a Jacobean play, which is that a servant physically interferes with something that his master, his acknowledged master, is doing, and draws a weapon against him to prevent him doing the thing. Now, it turns out the thing that the master is doing is putting out somebody else's eyes. So it's a situation where I think Shakespeare dramatizes, has such an extreme thing being done that even people who thought, no, servants should never interfere with their masters, should simply do what they're told, that even someone with that framework would have a hard time thinking the ideal thing is to just sit back and watch someone put their boot in someone else's eyes. So the servant who intervenes in that scene, which is an amazing scene, because you never see mutilation like Gloucester's blinding on stage. It's an absolute stage convention that things like that happen off stage, and a messenger comes in and says, oh, this terrible thing has happened. Oedipus has poked out his eyes. Oh dear.
Now does that call to mind then? There's the historicism leaking in there, right? Because we feel we look at that because we look at all the classics, especially the Greek tragedies, right? Oedipus goes off stage and comes back with a bandage over his eyes. He has gouged out his own eyes, right? For instance, as an example. And here we have our author breaking the mold, so to speak, and saying, we're going to do this right here in front of the audience and see how they like it.
And I've seen, people who haven't seen it, when I've been to productions where there have clearly been some people who haven't read the play, haven't seen it before. And I've seen people practically faint at that moment. It's horrible. And it's not the kind of thing, that's expected in the theater. So Shakespeare's doing something dramaturgically radical, I think, in order to do something politically radical. In other words, in order for the servant's intervention to be seen as a good thing rather than a terrible breach of propriety, it has to be such an extreme situation that, as I said, it's hard to defend passivity. And the servant says when he takes up arms against his master, he says, "This interfering with what you're doing is the best service I've ever done you." Mm. So he says, this is good service rather than bad service. That interfering with you, drawing a sword against you, is good service because you're doing something unworthy of yourself. You're doing something immoral, improper, unworthy of you, and I am going to act in terms of your best self. So, but in the period, there's a big debate about when, if ever, is disobedience allowed? And there's certainly an existing position that says never. And the great political theorist of this, and a little later than Shakespeare, is Thomas Hobbes, who just thought that the whole system would break down if hierarchy was not observed all the time. And in Shakespeare's period, there was a thinker, a religious thinker named Richard Hooker, who pretty much said the same thing. So, so there's a spectrum of belief in the period, from servants should simply obey whatever they're told to do, to thinkers who thought, no, servants must rely on their own conscience. And what I try to show is that Shakespeare, in the course of his career, moved more in the direction of embracing conscientious resistance, and so that he isn't always on the side of the constituted authority.
Well, and we see so many examples on both sides of this throughout the canon, including obviously in the tragedies, even in some of the tragic history, like for instance in Julius Caesar, when Brutus is seeking his underlings, soldiers or servants of his tent, to hold his sword while he runs upon it. And the first two of them refuse. No, I will not do that. I cannot do that for you. Right. Conversely, you see, like in Taming of the Shrew, when Petruchio says to Grumio, knock me here, knock me soundly. And Grumio, it's comic, making fun of the, sort of play on words and pretending to misunderstand. But then, when Hortensio pops in and intervenes, he says, if this not be fit for me to leave his service, he told me to hit him and rap him and strike him. And I asked you, would it have been right for me as a servant to do so, to follow those commands? So he loves to sort of dance around this, doesn't he? Your book, you quote Cymbeline, where he says, every good servant does not all commands, no bond, but to do just ones.
Right. That was very much, that was important. I mean, I had a colleague who also taught Shakespeare at the University of Chicago with me, a very famous Shakespearean editor and scholar named David Bevington. And when I showed David the draft of the essay on proper virtuous disobedience in King Lear, his reaction was, okay, you've shown this to be true about that play, but how can you go on to say Shakespeare believed this, which I, Richard Strier, wanted and want to say? So I said, okay, David, if I could show you that in plays written after King Lear, and we have a reasonable sense of the chronology of the plays, if I could show you that in plays after King Lear, this position that servants have a right to disobey is articulated, and articulated by characters we're supposed to sympathize with, would that count? And he said, yeah. So that's why the Cymbeline quote is so important, that's a play unquestionably written later than King Lear, where you have, as you read, a very clear statement that yes, servants are bound to obey, but only commands that are within the bounds of ordinary morality. So that in other words, you could say this is not just a motif that Shakespeare adopted for one play, but something that he actually believed, because it keeps recurring after it's fully developed in King Lear.
Well, I think absolutely that you see throughout the entire canon, and even in the sonnets, and even in some of the epic poetry, you see him sort of struggling, I think, with what service is and what duty is, and whether or not duty and honor are tied together in an unbreakable way. And I feel like he argues at times that it can be more honorable to refuse duty or to deny duty in certain circumstances. And there's where we start to see his
or to think
philosophy.
that you have a higher duty that calls upon you to resist a lower one. So where the servant says he's doing good service to his master by interfering, he's saying, I have a duty to sort of general humanity that outweighs my duty to you.
There is a lot in The Tempest, isn't there, that's really centered around power over others, whether it be magic, the magical power of Prospero over the elements. Ariel's seemingly own magical power over the winds and the rains. The Prospero's power over Caliban, Caliban's belief that he should have dominion over the island. Stefano having power over Trinculo just through the fact that he is the master of this butt of liquor that he has ridden ashore, and then using it almost in a way, almost like a pusher, getting Caliban addicted to the drug in order to now maintain power over Caliban. The usurpation of power of of Prospero's dukedom that begins the whole thing. The near attempted assassination of the King of Naples by his brother and cohorts. I mean, there's a lot going on there when it comes to power, but I find it really interesting that you've pointed out that the levels in there all suggest that servitude, it should not necessarily be compelled outright without question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the interesting questions the play raises is a question in humanist pedagogy. I mean, there's a big controversy about beating students in the classroom, corporal punishment in the classroom, and the general view was that this was a good thing, that if students don't behave, you beat them and they'll behave better, and but there were some thinkers in the period, and it's always important to me to say that there's nothing that everybody believed at any given time. So that as soon as I hear somebody say, "Well, back then everybody was a misogynist or everybody was a racist," I want to say, no, that's not true.
That can't be possible. If that were possible, thought wouldn't evolve.
Well, I mean, you might think, well, everybody thought something, and then the world got better, and everybody became more enlightened, and there's sort of stages, and that people went from a less enlightened to a more enlightened state. And what I want to say is that yes, there are dominant ideologies, and say male superiority might be one of them in the period, but there were people who didn't, who contested it, and that so that the general belief was yes, beating students was good for them, but there were important thinkers who said it wasn't, and that it said that this was a disastrous pedagogical strategy, and I try to show that one of Prospero's roles is as a sort of school teacher to Caliban. And we're told that Caliban can't learn unless you beat him. That he's someone who stripes the marks that a whip makes on him works better than kindness on him. And it turns out that's just not true. And that all of the objections that a figure like Erasmus, a sort of progressive humanist, had towards beating, saying that all it does is make the teacher coarse and the student filled with rage, turned out to be exactly borne out in The Tempest. So yeah, I mean, I try to show that there are lots of different frameworks in which Shakespeare is showing that this sort of normally held belief might be questionable. And I mean, another case is the rule of fathers over children. And in the comedies, daughters are always disobeying their father and running off and marrying running off with somebody who the father doesn't approve of. And in Midsummer Night's Dream, I mean, the father gives a little speech saying, I am God to you, and I created you, and I can do whatever I want with you. And
it's that old Cosby show quote, I brought you into this world, I can take you out.
There you go. There you go. That's right. The father says something like that. And the daughter says, okay, well, so you say, but I'm not going to do what you say. I'm going to marry who I want to marry and not who you want me to marry. And she runs off with the boy she likes. And it's not at all clear that the play is on the father's side. So this is another case where of course, patriarchy.
In Romeo and Juliet, he starts to beat her, and the nurse intervenes, and he strikes the nurse, and finally his wife intervenes and says, enough, you've already struck our daughter, now you've struck our loyal servant. What does she say? She says, you are too hot, and his response is, my fingers itch. Like, you get out of my way or you're next, kind of a thing. Right. So no, it's not very sympathetic to the paternal role at all.
Right. No, this is, so, I mean, it's, for me, I mean, in terms of, from a historicist point of view, it's very much important to show that we think of as progressive thinking was possible in these past periods, so that not everyone was a misogynist and a white supremacist and a believer in that the king was always right or authorities were always right.
Particularly this writer. Another one comes to mind is Much Ado About Nothing. When Hero is denounced, Leonardo goes after her and they have to hold him back from strangling her. And once she's laying there fainted and limp, he says, do not look up, do not live. And the priest says, yea, why should she not? And he says, that not everything cry shame upon her. She should just die. These are portrayals in the canon that I think stand in sharp contrast to the idea that, Shakespeare was this, old white guy, patriarchal society, misogynist, supremacist. I think that's all hogwash.
Right. I agree with you completely. And takes some effort to show it. And you have to sort of fight against, there are people who say, well, we mustn't impose our values on old texts. After all, this is a text written 400 years ago when people thought very differently and thought that, kings were great and that fathers should have power over who their children marry, etc. And yes, those were dominant ideologies. But I want to say that in any period, there's always an opposition to dominant ideologies available. And one of the things that we look at literature, especially great literature, for is to see some opposition to existing dominant ideologies. And someone like Shakespeare or Marlowe, the theater was a place where you could get away with showing some fairly radical things as long as you didn't cross certain boundaries. You couldn't insult important people by name. You couldn't get involved in religious controversies very directly. But if you didn't do that, you could sort of say almost whatever you wanted. And so, yes, there was censorship. All plays had to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain for him to approve it. But basically, it wasn't, the model of censorship was not like in Stalin's Russia or what Trump would like to do in America, where everybody has to think what the monarch thinks. So there was the theater was a place where and it was a place where people went to see ideas tested and to have an intellectual experience, because there were lots of other competing activities.
Okay, well, I don't know that all of those. I don't know that I would agree that all of those comparisons are relative to each other, especially when you think about how many writers in the Elizabethan period suffered torture, maiming, and beheading because of some of the things that they wrote. And certainly Stalin took firing squads to his advantage. And I don't think anyone is going to suggest that anyone's going to be beheaded, lose their hands, or face a firing squad for drawing a funny cartoon about the current president or putting out a meme on social media, or
you might lose your job, which is a pretty serious thing.
I mean, true totalitarianism, I think, is, power over life and death. And I think it's hyperbole to suggest that is anything near like what we're facing in anywhere in this country. Maybe in North Korea, that might be true. I don't know. China, parts of China for sure, and certainly parts of Africa right now. If you're the wrong religion, you could be slaughtered just for praying. We're seeing some peace finally happening in the Middle East. I often wonder what Shakespeare would feel about those types of conflicts, because he definitely was in tune to the conflicts of his day, including religious conflict. You talk about your book is divided into sections, and the third section is literally called Beliefs. And I particularly sort of glommed on to section 10, which is titled Shakespeare and Skepticism. Shakespeare and Skepticism Part 2, and it's about epistemology. And I love that you clearly say that there are two things in Shakespeare scholarship that seem to be so prevalent, but yet completely incompatible, that we cannot be sure where Shakespeare stands on anything, including religion, except there is some evidence he's quite sympathetic to Catholicism. But we can be sure where he stands on the general philosophical world, and that he was some sort of epistemological, well, that's a tough word, isn't it? A skeptic. So then you write, we cannot be sure of anything except that he was sure that we cannot be sure of anything. And that just literally made me laugh out loud.
Well, it's supposed to. I'm glad you laughed. I'm glad, when you make a scholarly joke, you hope somebody gets it. But this is, it's a very, the view that Shakespeare had beliefs at all is oddly controversial. And of course, I think, as we've been discussing for the last 45 minutes or so, Shakespeare had definite beliefs. But there are people who think, well, respectable academics, etc., who think, well, look, the guy was just writing popular entertainments. He wasn't really he wasn't, after all, he wasn't a preacher. He was a playwright, and he's just trying to amuse people. And really, you shouldn't sort of look to the plays for serious intellectual content, but that he's just sort of playing with ideas. And this seems to me wrong. But one of the things that goes along with that position is that, well, he basically didn't believe in holding positions. That he sort of thought that, well, you should just sort of let anyone believe anything they wanted, and he didn't really believe anything in particular, and or you sort of couldn't be certain of anything, and so that if you can't be certain of anything, then you don't have any real beliefs. So you can see how these positions sort of go together. And so kind of in order for me to assert that Shakespeare had beliefs, I kind of have to say he's not a complete skeptic, that he does think you can know things, and you can even, to some extent, know other people's minds, and to some extent know your own. And I end up with the sort of paradoxical position that I think, in some ways, Shakespeare thought you could know other people better than you could know yourself. And so it's so this is one of the controversial positions in the book. Because certainly there are a lot of people who think Shakespeare thought everyone was mysterious to everyone else, and that's the end of it. And I don't think that's true.
I think that's a great point. And, when we look at some of the critical analysis of Shakespeare over the centuries, and obviously Harold Bloom always comes to mind, and his famous book, The Invention of the Human. And I think more than anything, that points out exactly what you just said, that he sort of had this belief that you could understand others better than self. I feel like he had difficulty with self-reflection throughout his life, and I think that that's demonstrated through the plays. But I do think he uses characters to define others. And in many cases, I think, including the monarch of his time and the surrounding court, I think he also tends to try to define people of certain trades and crafts, as it were, and does so quite well throughout the works. Whether it be, a tanner, a gravedigger, whatever it happens to be. But you do sort of sum it up quite well in number 11, mind, nature, heterodoxy, and iconoclasm, with The Winter's Tale. And one of the things that you point out there is that he also seems to be obsessed with jealousy. As much as we see this constant theme of him sort of grappling with service and servitude and duty and honor, we also see him grappling with this idea of jealousy in many of the plays, most particularly that one. Obviously, Othello is a huge one.
Yes.
But you point out something that I think is very interesting, in that for him, and in almost every instance, there might be a couple of instances where it's not quite, I'm thinking As You Like It, there's a little bit of female jealousy that sort of creeps into that play. But you point out very accurately that it's almost always male jealousy directed to or at a woman to whom the man is married or betrothed or is supposed to marry. And almost every time it is played out in a vengeful way.
Yeah.
Here is a man who obviously
and is false and is unwarranted.
Yes, and then it's learned. You learn that it was all fake, or whether it's Much Ado About Nothing or Winter's Tale or Othello. Those are three great examples. It's always he was duped. He was deceived by someone else or some circumstance or other that led to this false jealousy and the horrific treatment of the heroine involved. To the shame of the man.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that's about? Why do you think that is such a prevalent thing that pops up again and again and again with him?
Well, I think that Shakespeare, one of the things about The Winter's Tale is that it's so clearly, the jealousy there is presented so clearly as a pathology. Because in that case, there's no Iago. There's no setting up a scene to make somebody jealous the way there is in Much Ado. That this guy just does it to himself. That there's absolutely no one leading him into this. So it becomes very clear that as Shakespeare's thinking evolved, and I think his thinking did evolve the way his thinking about service evolved. I think his thinking about jealousy, sort of The Winter's Tale, culminates in sort of seeing it so clearly as a pathology, as something, as a form of insanity, and but something that somehow men, I mean, because of the complexities of fatherhood, that you're always worrying, well, is this child my child? How do you know? Now, of course, now we have DNA and all that to prove or disprove this. Well, the Elizabethans, that's something they didn't have. They really didn't have. And so it becomes a matter of trust. And I think trust is something Shakespeare is very interested in. And the willingness to in a way believe the surface when it's called upon, or not believe in the surface when it's called upon, was very important to Shakespeare. And I think that's why The Winter's Tale is again such a clear case that there's that the jealousy is even more shocking in that play, because the woman is even, well, is just as clearly as Desdemona not guilty of anything, and it involves such a deep misunderstanding. So yes, Shakespeare understood that the world of aristocratic friendship and courtship involved a certain amount of flirtatiousness between the sexes, just as it does now. That it's part of a sort of social life. But to understand there's a difference between sort of pleasant flirtatiousness and actual sexual behavior is just part of sanity, and part of trusting that the woman that you're involved with actually is a person of integrity. And so I think the breakdown of trust is something Shakespeare is very, very interested in.
Well, and if we circle back to the Tempest, what we find there is that Prospero didn't always treat Caliban the way we find him treated. He at first welcomed him in.
That's right.
And it's not until Caliban attempts to rape Prospero's daughter, Miranda, that suddenly he is now an outcast. He is treated like a member of a penal colony now, because he has been found guilty of a heinous crime, and thus this is his punishment.
Right, and this is, I mean, what's interesting there is that Prospero takes no responsibility, and Prospero sees himself as somebody to whom terrible things happen. I was deposed from my dukedom. My surrogate son tried to rape my daughter. Poor me, poor me. And now that I have some power, I'm going to try to rectify all this. And but it's perfectly clear in the play that he was a terrible ruler and paid no attention to ruling his kingdom. And it wasn't a big surprise that his brother, he says, okay, you be Duke everything but name. And it's a ridiculous situation. And of course, we know that it looks as if he had Caliban and his daughter sleeping in the same cave for years and years and years. And never occurred to him that, at some point, Caliban, who seems to be a sort of a kind of adolescent when we first meet him, would actually grow up, and his daughter would grow up, and that this is an issue. And so the idea that he had some culpability in not sort of monitoring the situation better than he did never occurs to him. Just as it never occurs to him that by giving his brother all the power and saying, okay, you have all the power, but I'm still the Duke, this is not a viable situation. So I think Shakespeare is very, very aware of the way in which people can be sort of self-deceived in their righteous anger.
In his mind, they sort of, since he's sort of raising them together, they should have a filial relationship, right? They should be brother and sister, and the idea that that line would ever be crossed is not something that he even considers, let alone fathoms. Thus, when the incident occurs, it makes it even more atrocious to him, doesn't it?
Right. How could this happen? Where, like, it's any sensible parent, nowadays would understand, okay, when your children are, infants, you can put your boy and your girl in the same room. But at some point, when they become adolescents, you want to probably give them each their own space and not have them sleeping in the same bed or sleeping in the same room. And this just never occurs to Prospero. He just so he's violently angry at Caliban, who acts in a way that's completely predictable. The way his brother. Now, it doesn't mean these are admirable ways to act. It's not admirable to usurp your brother or to try to rape your pseudo sister. On the other hand, it's not that surprising in the circumstance. And Prospero just never takes any responsibility.
So if we were sort of like an FBI profiler, we might be able to look at the works of this writer and say, okay, he obviously has an obsession with jealousy and trust. So he most likely was either betrayed or believed at one point he was betrayed by a woman in his life. And then it looks like it probably turned out to not be true. And so now he has regret for the way he treated her because of it. He has an opposition towards those who should have a filial sense of love. And if they cross that line, he sees that as practically incestuous behavior, right? And so there's some sort of a weirdness that he has there. He definitely is struggling with the idea of class and servitude and what duty and honor mean with regards to whether or not it is moral to follow the orders of a superior or to serve a master or maybe even a monarch. We see a lot of characters disguising themselves as other characters to get away with things or do things or deceive each other. That seems to be another obsession of his. And then the one I really want to sort of touch on here at the end of our conversation is he obviously also has an obsession with the law. And as you write, he is inextricably linked with the law, and legal terms, as you say, permeate his plays. And some of your more recent work involves Shakespeare and the law. And I was so intrigued to see that it's a work that you co-edited. And you'll know the players better than I will because you were involved in. Were you when you're co-editing? Is there an editor-in-chief and then an assistant editor? How does co-editing actually really work?
That's a good question. It depends. It's like co-teaching. It depends on the circumstance. I mean, ideally, everybody has an assignment, and you divide up the work, and everybody does their assignment, and everybody's happy. It often turns out that someone is not quite as committed to the project as somebody else, and so one person ends up doing, there's not necessarily an official.
Oh, kind of like a lab partner in high school biology.
Yeah, somebody ends up doing most of the work. is what happens when it doesn't work perfectly. But the advantage of co-editing is again, it's like co-teaching. If it works, you bring in another perspective, and you have someone who has some knowledge or skills that you don't have, and so the Shakespearean law thing came out of a conference, which was at the law school, and I did a fair amount of co-teaching with a a philosopher who has very wide interests, a woman named Martha Nussbaum, who is one of the co-editors of that collection. And she has a sense and she'd been very important at the law school in sort of making law part of a general intellectual discussion and not just a sort of technical specialty. And that was a lot of fun. And I co-taught a Shakespeare course with her at the law school, with her and a judge named Dick Posner, and it worked pretty well.
I know his work very well. I've done some study and research into Shakespeare and the law, and Posner is probably one of the most often cited American legal experts when it comes to this topic.
That's right. But Dick, oddly enough, is one of the people who didn't believe that Shakespeare really had ideas. So we were constantly, so I would say, well, Shakespeare's putting forth this idea in the play, and he'd say, no, he's not doing that. So Dick was oddly a formalist. It was very strange that way.
That is very surprising to me, considering, I don't know, it seems impossible to me to look at the amount of legal erudition you find and to not see it as statements quite often about fairness and justice and what is right and what is wrong, especially in areas such as like common law thinking and common law practice, which you point out in the second section of that collection. That's like a strong area of study there, and that's very shocking to me.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that interests me about Shakespearean law is it seems to me that this was a situation where he really was not sure what he thought about certain things. So that I'm very interested I point out there's a moment in Henry IV, Part 2, where a servant is discussing with his master who should be punished for a crime, and the servant says, "Well, you shouldn't punish so and so because he's my friend, and he did the thing, but he's my friend, and I have a special loyalty to him." And so there's a question of, should this count? Should friendship count? Should you treat your father the same way, or your son the same way you treat anybody else? Should you treat your friend who does something wrong differently from somebody else? And one model is, of course, you should be impartial. But another model is that doesn't make any sense. We're beings who have sort of circles of affinity, and the circle of affinity gets thinner as it gets wider, and that's just normal. And and I think that and of course this comes to a head in the rejection of Falstaff at the end of that play, where Falstaff is relying on a personal relationship to sort of get away with various things, and is told at the end of the play, "No, that won't work. I don't care who you are. You're gonna suffer impersonal justice." And I think this is an issue that this is where philosophy and literature come together, which is there are a lot of interesting philosophical work these days on this question of, is impartiality always the right thing? When does it matter that somebody is your brother or your friend or your son? And and I think Shakespeare really was. I think that was an issue that he was interested in exploring, and I'm not sure he had a clear position on it. I think that that's one that he really did see both sides of. But
it's
also
it's sort of connected to
the side of that. Well, maybe friendship does matter. You see, the impartial view is so much easier to articulate, and yet there might be something wrong with it. And I think that's one of the things that Shakespeare is exploring in Henry IV, Part 2, and in Measure for Measure, in his thinking about law, about, well, when does impartiality, when is it the wrong thing?
Or when does blood
really
matter,
happy?
right? Because there seems to be an issue of, when does blood matter? When does blood relation matter? When does royal blood matter?
That's right.
When does blood matter? And I think he touches on that quite often. I just recently did an episode with a professor of Italian literature, and she pointed out Niccolo Machiavelli's work. And Machiavelli was famous for saying laws are made and broken according to the convenience of those who command. And she argued that had that sort of philosophy, or that she called it that criticism of the law and those who wield the law, is something that influenced Shakespeare's work. And obviously he was definitely influenced by a lot of Italian writers. And that was one of the points that she had made. And I think there's some validity to that, because I think, especially as we were saying, in the totalitarian world of Elizabethan England, it's sort of, whatever the Queen says goes. If she wants to be merciful, she can be. If she doesn't want to be, she won't be. But I mean,
again, I want to say, even in that world, people spoke up, and the Queen had a council who, sometimes told her that she couldn't do things she wanted to do. James had a parliament. Now he had some problems with the parliament, but this whole question of, can the monarch? This is one of the great questions of it. Can the monarch do anything he wants? And I mentioned Marvell's poem about the execution of the king. When in the sort of most radical point of the English Civil War, or the English Revolution, when the king was put on trial.
Charles I, right? Is that what you're talking about, Charles I?
That's right.
Yeah.
Charles I, when he was put on trial by members of Parliament, his position was not, I didn't do anything wrong. His position was, you have no right to try me. I am above the law. That is so that it doesn't matter whether or not you think I did anything wrong. And the parliamentarians are saying, no one is above the law, and you can be judged by the law.
I mean, talk about adding fuel to the fire. I mean, he was so oblivious that he didn't realize that type of thinking, that attitude, was exactly the reason why they were so upset and angry. Like, I mean, it's just, if you think about it, he's like channeling the spirit of Richard II, right? Because, if Shakespeare is to be believed, Richard II sort of takes that same position. I'm an ordained king. I'm an anointed king. You don't have any power to do this to me.
Well, but that was a powerful position. I mean, there's a sense. I mean, there are certain people who there was a whole ideology of divine right monarchy,
mm-hmm.
and that the king is a sort of representative of God on earth, and has a special position, and isn't part of the Commonwealth. Is in a completely different position, and you hope that he's going to behave well, but if he doesn't, you've just got to suffer, and it's God's will. And there's an Elizabethan homily. There's a homily on obedience that basically says that. It says, well, what do you do if the king is wicked? And the answer is, you suffer, and you pray, and you hope for a better king, but you don't take up arms against him. And this was a powerful ideology in the period. But there's also the counter ideology, which is the one we've been talking about, that no one is above the law, and the king is just part of a legal system. And but these are two. I mean, one of the things that Shakespeare seems to have recognized was that there were competing ideologies, and that they just coexisted. And at times, certain people could articulate one, and others would articulate others. And now I think he was a little dubious about absolute monarchy, but he certainly knew about the position. And as you say, Richard II articulates it.
Well, and as you point out, there's a lot of his use of the law in the plays and in the circumstances that come up, or in the characters who reference certain legal positions. In some cases, he demonstrates knowledge of specific legal cases of the time, and are referenced by certain characters in certain plays, and almost always for the reason of sort of demonstrating the effect on politics and the prevailing thought of the day. And almost always I feel like he is trying to establish a layer of justice with a capital J, as opposed to justice as it is seen under the law. Almost as though he is appealing to a higher power for the definition of justice. And we see characters like, for instance, Portia, the quality of mercy is not strained, for instance. Those types of moments in Measure for Measure, you actually have a heroine character who isn't, people mistake and say she's a nun. That's not what the text says. She's been raised in a convent, but she's not actually a nun.
She's training to be a nun, but she's not there.
Well, postulant, I think, is the term that
she's a novitiate. She's a novice.
But nonetheless, she is, this virginous, moral, virtuous woman. And, Angelo, obviously, I always saw him as sort of the twisty mustache villain, who goes, I will tie you to the railroad tracks type of a thing, to sort of prove the point that justice has to technically come from above, I believe, is sort of the philosophy he continues to show. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm not sure quite what that means. I mean, I think in Measure for Measure, there's a question of, well, when is it right to prosecute a crime? So the central prosecution is of Isabella's brother for fornication, and he's breaking because he's slept with his fiancée before they are absolutely legally married. Does this count as fornication? And then what sort of punishment is appropriate? And the central sort of legal issue in the play is, well, the law says, apparently, there's a law in the books in Vienna at the time that fornication is punished by death. And so, Angelo, in his rigid judge mode, says, well, okay, we're going to enforce this law. And so the question is, well, when, that it's not obvious from a law when it counts that it's being broken. I mean, what counts as fornication? The guy is basically married to this woman, but he's not officially most legally married. So does that count? And does this punishment make sense for this particular crime? And I think those are the issues that I think the play is interested in. What would constitute a sort of reasonable legal system?
Meanwhile, you have Pompey the pimp, whoring out Mistress Overdone, and they're not punished for fornication at all. they're just allowed to exist on that side of the river, kind of thing.
That's right. They have to move their operation. That's right. But that raises. Pompey raises and again an issue that's still alive. I mean, what makes sense for the law to prohibit? So Pompey says, well, the authority says to him, well, what you do, prostitution is illegal. You've got to be punished. And Pompey says, well, maybe you should just make it legal. Why not? And after all, there are countries, even cities in this country where prostitution is legal.
Yes, that's
and
true.
it's like with drugs. I mean, I think there's a whole question of that Shakespeare is interested in, that it's not so clear how the law, that you have to sort of make distinctions and decide, well, what's going to count as a crime, what's an appropriate punishment, in a world where none of these things are crystal clear, except in certain cases. Like, one of the interesting things about Measure for Measure is that it's clear that Angelo attempts to be a criminal and doesn't exactly succeed. But the one clear criminal who's a murderer, Bernardine, isn't punished. By the end of the play, he's forgiven also. So, which raises, I think, Shakespeare's raising the question: well, when is forgiveness appropriate? Is total forgiveness the right approach? And I think this is why I think Measure for Measures since the late 19th century have been known as a problem play. It's a play, and I think that's a clever sort of term for it. That it's a play that's meant to make you think about these issues. In this case, I'm not sure Shakespeare has a clear position. I think there is a clear position that says, yes, when a crime is absolutely clear, it looks as if punishment is appropriate. But on the other hand, the title of the play is pointing you towards the Sermon on the Mount, where the most authoritative speaker in the Christian tradition says, "Don't punish anybody." That let him who has sinned cast the first stone. So everyone's guilty. Everyone could be punished. So no one should be punished.
We all got it coming, kid, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
and I think like so many of the other issues that we find in Shakespeare plays, and in the sonnets as well, I think you find this revolutionary thinker who brought so many of these issues and questions to the table ahead of his time. And I would even argue that he's one of the first anti-death penalty positions, takes one of the first anti-death penalty positions we could see in literature. And I think he's making that argument when it comes to blood and relation and mercy. And he's, I think, to some degree saying, well, when you put someone to death, you're punishing everyone who loves that someone, and they haven't committed the crime. And I think that there's an argument to be made there. I think he also had a problem with a government putting its own citizens to death. And I think he saw that as tyrannical. That if the government has the power to kill its own citizens, then the potential abuse for that power has now been opened up, and it is better to show mercy and keep the offender in prison and alive than it is to open the door to exercise the power of government over life and death of its citizens. And I think you see that in Measure for Measure and some of the other plays.
Well, I think that's possible. That's why Bernardine is such an interesting case, because it's clear they haven't been. I mean, the story there is that he's been in prison for a long time, but he hasn't been executed because isn't absolutely clear that he committed the murder he's accused of. But we're told in the course of the play that it's now absolutely clear that Bernardine is a murderer. And so this is the supreme test case for capital punishment. That you have a clear case of a murderer who doesn't dispute the fact that he did it, and the evidence shows that he did it. And so the question is, well, what do you do? And so if there's a case for execution, that would be the case. And we don't know what would have been the appropriate punishment for Bernardine, it looks as if just forgiving him and saying, "Oh, you're free now," somehow that doesn't seem right.
No, that's kind of extreme, isn't it?
So the question is, well, what do you do?
That's no cash bail. I don't know about that. That might not be a good idea.
So you say, well, okay, maybe life imprisonment is better than execution, but it's certainly possible to imagine someone saying, "I'd rather be executed."
Well, I also feel like there's some statement being made there, and again, pointing back to Merchant of Venice, where it is within the right of the Duke, because Shylock the Jew has sought the death of a Christian, to be put to death, but he's not. Instead, he's forced to convert to Christianity, and I think there's a statement being made there about redemption, and that when the state or the government or the monarch or whoever makes a condemnation of death and executes someone, they have removed that person's opportunity for redemption. You've basically taken that soul into your own hands and out of the hands of whatever higher power they might eventually turn to before their death and find absolution from their crimes, their sins, whatever it might be. And I think that, when we look at the works of Shakespeare, we definitely see somebody who knew the Bible, particularly the Psalms pop up all over the place, and obviously had a connection to religion, and as you point out, probably a Catholic sympathist, which I have to agree.
Believe that? No, I don't believe that. That's something that in general a lot of people believe. I don't.
You don't. I see. Okay.
No. I think that's just one of the things that is believed on the basis of very shabby evidence, and it's part of a kind of nostalgia for a pre-modern world. And so
I think a lot of people would argue that when it comes to this writer, everything is shabby evidence, and that's one of the biggest problems. And when it comes to Shakespearean issues, that's probably the greatest of them all, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah. I mean, it'd be nice if we knew more. I mean, but I think the plays, we have all these plays. I think there's plenty to work with. But I mean, in terms of the conversion of Shylock, I think Shakespeare is very dubious about that also, and forcing someone to convert has always been a controversial issue. And again, I think just as Shakespeare wants us to feel a little uncomfortable about the rejection of Falstaff, that maybe friendship should count more than it does there. I think Shakespeare feeling that well, okay, you take away most of the guy's money, you take away his chance to determine his inheritor, and you take away the guy's religion, and meanwhile you say we're being merciful. Shakespeare would say, well, wait a minute, maybe being merciful would involve leaving the guy alone and saying, okay, you can't have your pound of flesh, but go away and don't bother anybody.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that forced conversion is even a thing. I feel like that's quite honestly impossible to do.
Well, that's what happens to Shylock. He's told he's got to become a Christian.
How do they know whether or not he's at home still praying the way he always prayed and believing the way he always? I mean, you can't force the mind to believe or think the way you want it to believe or think, right?
Why force him to go through rituals that he doesn't believe in?
Well, and I think the argument could be made that the same was true in Elizabethan England, where suddenly Henry VIII goes, well, you know what? I'm the head of the church now, and you're going to all pray the way I want you to pray. And that's why you still had people secretly praying the way they wanted to pray and having secret, Catholic masses in caves and in basements and whatnot. I mean, I think Shakespeare's astute enough to know that there is great danger and also just absurdity in the idea of I'm going to force you to convert to my religion.
Mm-hmm. But certainly that no one says that in the play.
No,
the Duke thinks that he's doing Shylock a favor by doing the conversion and taking away most of his estate instead of killing him. And Shylock says at one point, if you take away all my money, you might as well kill me. I have no way to live. So I mean, I think and there certainly are thinkers in the period who say what you said, who say, look, this idea of forced conversion is crazy because you can't change someone's mind by torturing them or threatening them. So I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Merchant Venice is that in the source, I mean, Shakespeare's got he's basing the play on an Italian short story, which has the pound of flesh and the drop of blood business in it. But when the trick is played on Shylock and the okay, you can have your pound of flesh, but not a drop of blood, and that won't work. Shylock says, well, okay, can I at least have my principal back? And they say, no, you don't have anything. And he said, okay. So he just runs off and leaves the court. And there's absolutely no mention of forced conversion in the source story. This is completely added by Shakespeare to the pound of flesh, drop of blood story, which is in the short story that he's basing the play on. So he added that. He added that to the story, and because I think he wanted to raise the question of, well, what counts as mercy? Does it count as mercy to make someone conform to the dominant religion? Is that mercy? Is that more merciful than killing him in the first place? And I think Shakespeare wants to. I think you're supposed to feel. He wants you to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of a live and let live attitude, and it's why should I care how you pray in your home? Why should I care what religion, what God you want to believe in?
What's interesting to me is there are people in the period who said things like that, who said, why should another man's religion bother me?
Right.
Why not just let everyone live by their own conscience? And there are people who said that in the period, that not everyone believed, everyone has to be a proper Catholic, or everyone has to be a proper Calvinist. Or yeah, sure, there were people who believed that their religion was the only right religion. But there were also people in the period who believed there's no such thing as a right religion. That there's a variety of religion is just the normal situation and is how it should be. Montaigne, for instance, in France thought this. I think that's a moment when Merchant of Venice is raising an issue that it wants you to sort of puzzle over.
As someone who throughout your career has engaged and embraced so much of the philosophy and the idea of collaborative scholarship and co-teaching and co-editing and working on collections of essays with others, do you have any inclination to believe that perhaps the works of Shakespeare were collaborative, that there were other writers? I mean, we do have some evidence of like Fletcher, Beaumont, perhaps Monday, Lilly being involved. How do you feel about the idea that maybe the reason we see such a fantastic collection of knowledge and interests and topics is because there was sort of a think tank involved?
No, I mean, there's no doubt some of the plays are collaborations. I mean, Pericles is certainly a collaboration. There's some pretty good evidence that Titus Andronicus is a collaboration, and probably some of the Henry VI plays are collaborations. I think most of the Shakespeare plays are single author plays, and I don't see any reason to think that King Lear or Othello or The Tempest aren't written by the guy who we think they were written by, who was actually William Shakespeare and not somebody else. The one thing I always used to say to my Shakespeare class on the first day is, I'm willing to entertain any thoughts in this course that you might have, except one, which is that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. So
well, what about this thought? What about the thought that William Shakespeare of Stratford is not William Shakespeare, the writer?
Yeah.
That they are two different Shakespeares.
I think there's no good. I mean, Shakespeare is a reasonably well documented. I mean, yes, there are documents we don't have, but he's living in a world of very, to come back to a word we used, very jealous and competitive writers. And early on in his career, people would say, complaining, other playwrights were going, Shakespeare is stealing my stuff, and who does he think he is? And so there would have been lots of people would be happy to say, Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. But anyway, he's living in a world where everyone's looking over each other's shoulders. His name starts appearing on title pages of plays. Nobody says they don't belong there. So I mean, there's very little credibility to the notion that William Shakespeare, the guy who was from Stratford, etc., wrote the plays. The collaboration is a different issue. I mean, I think he certainly did collaborate in cases, and in which cases, which scholars are still disputing. Well, how much collaboration is there? Is there collaboration in Timon of Athens as well as in Titus Andronicus? Maybe, but on the other hand, there's almost no one saying that there's a collaborator.
Was there an editor? Was there a cleaner, a finisher who got a hold of the manuscripts and made changes, revisions, additions to the plays between 1611 and 1623 when we get the first folio? Is there maybe a dozen years there where someone else had them in their possession and was monkeying with them?
Well, I mean, the people who owned the scripts were his theater company. And they could continue putting on the plays whenever they wanted to. And what we have in the first folio is a very carefully edited volume where someone in the print shop is deciding punctuation and that kind of thing. Because what evidence we have is that Shakespeare's manuscripts were probably very lightly punctuated, and and it was just normal in the period for the printer would decide on accidentals, on capitalizations, punctuation, etc.
Was Ben Jonson ever tempted to change an ending or add a scene before he puts it all together and helps the Herbert
in his own plays?
No, in the Shakespeare work. I mean, obviously Jonson had something to do with the publishing of the first folio. The Herbert brothers, were they writers? Were they tempted to go, you know what, this play would be better if we added this scene or changed this ending before getting it to the printer?
Well, I mean, Jonson certainly helped the folio in the sense he wrote a great poem to be printed in the folio, and he was a model for. It was very unusual for a vernacular playwright, someone who wrote in English, to publish his own plays. And Jonson was extremely unusual in publishing his own plays and English poems. So his folio is a kind of model for Shakespeare's folio. But I don't see why he would have wanted to monkey with Shakespeare's plays. He had his own plays to worry about. And there's no I don't think there's any evidence at all for Jonson interfering or even collaborating with. He's not a possible collaborator for on the Shakespeare plays.
Do you think he recognized that his own works were not as good? Do you think he recognized that the works of Shakespeare surpassed his own writing to the degree that they did?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think he might have thought his comedies were better. Whether he thought his tragedies were better, I'm not sure. But that poem he wrote for Shakespeare, when he says Shakespeare is better than the ancients, and that he's Shakespeare's for all time. This is extraordinary praise. So I think it's possible that Johnson did think that. I think he thought he was pretty great, and he might have thought Shakespeare was greater. It's possible. I think that's possible. And that poem is just an amazing poem for someone who reverenced the classical authors the way Johnson did and aspired to be a kind of classic himself. To say that Shakespeare was better than Sophocles, this is extraordinary.
Well,
and,
I think I agree. I think he was better than Sophocles. I mean, just
well,
saying.
But I think Johnson. I think he might have. I mean, everyone kind of recognized that Shakespeare was something special in the period. I mean, he was the most published playwright. The plays were extremely popular. Many of them went into print. Not all of them, obviously. Some of them had to wait till the first folio, but about half of them went into print in his lifetime, and some of them went through many editions. I mean, Henry IV went through six printed editions. I mean, the history plays were the most popular. And the comedies. So, I think, it's a period. It's like a period now. It's like, did people who in Hollywood, did people who recognize that Ford or Hitchcock were geniuses? I mean, you recognize genius. Or it's like, the closest thing I can think of to Shakespeare's career is Bob Dylan's career.
Really? That's interesting.
And it's the same story. They both come from provincial towns where they get a good education. They're quite literate, but they don't go to the most prestigious schools. They come to a situation. So Bob Dylan comes to the folk scene in New York in the 60s. It's a well-developed scene, and he hangs out for a while and starts stealing guitar licks from this and that person. And then eventually starts writing these songs and putting them out. And everybody realizes something, this is a phenomenon. That there are people who hated Dylan, but just there are people early on who hated Shakespeare.
I just wish he would have learned how to sing. I mean, that's, his music's great. I just wish he would have let somebody else sing it.
Ben Jonson thought that, that Shakespeare should have learned to revise and be more careful.
That's great.
But, he said, somebody praised Shakespeare for not blotting his words, not making corrections.
Right.
Supposedly Johnson said Woody had blotted 1,000. But the way everyone in the folk scene in the 60s it had to be there. There has to be a scene for a genius to come onto. I mean, Shakespeare didn't invent popular theater. It had to be already, just as Dylan didn't invent folk music. But they come into fairly thriving scenes and suddenly start producing this extraordinary stuff.
Something about the 60s in just about every century, the 1560s, the 1660s, the 1760s, the 60s of each century have been very momentous for that in crazy ways, haven't they? It's kind of crazy.
Could be.
Well, Richard, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing your work and your insight. It's been a fascinating and intriguing conversation. I want to remind the listeners, folks, you can find Richard's work. It's Richard Strier, Strier. You can find his work on Amazon. It is very available. Again, there are multiple books there. The most recent one, the one we covered the most today, is called Shakespearean Issues, Agency, Skepticism, and Other Puzzles. But
it's out in paperback.
Yes, it is. And but his other works are also available. One that I tend to want to dive into next is Love Known, Theology and Experience in George Herbert's Poetry, because I'm just fascinated with the fact that the Stanleys and the Herberts were such a literary family for generations, and George Herbert is proof that continued later throughout history. So I'm very curious about that. And so don't be surprised, Richard, if after I read it, I'm not sending you an email asking questions about that one.
Okay, I look forward to it.
Very good. Thank you again, sir.
This was fun. Thank you.
So there you have it, fellow Quillers. Another fascinating conversation with another fellow Shakespeare file. Though we may not agree on Shakespeare authorship, we certainly agree that the authorship of Shakespeare is an important topic. And I want to thank Professor Richard Strier for taking the time to join us today and sharing his work and his research and analysis of the greatest works of literature ever written. Hey, before we wrap up, I do want to say, don't forget, if you haven't already, you should join our email subscriber list. That's how you find out who is going to be coming on the program. Future episodes, bonus features, and other information will be found through our email subscriber list. You can subscribe to the email list right from the homepage of our website. That's don'tquillthepodcast.com. don'tquillthepodcast.com. Just add your email and you'll be included in our not quite monthly email updates. I am kind of bad about sending them out every month. There's not always something to share every month, but when I do share, it's important information about upcoming episodes, details about some of those episodes, bonus features, as I mentioned, and of course, any Quiller events or information that we think that you ought to know about. We do not share that email list with anyone, and we don't bombard your inbox with a bunch of stuff. So it's just a way to stay informed. You can also stay informed by joining the Patreon page. It is free to join. Of course, if you go to the Patreon page, that's patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger. You will find information about how to support the program. And of course, those of you who are already supporting the program at the various levels, we thank you so much. We do this because of you and with your help, and the rest of the Quiller Nation enjoys it thanks to your generous support. So thank you again. And that said, it is time to turn it over to our very own producer, Jake, to announce the November Quiller of the Month.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and hello, Quillers. It is that time once again. If you're not sure what this is, well, you should be. We've been doing it for a long time. Head on over to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger. All eligible patrons get entered into a monthly contest to see who is the official Quiller of the Month. The winner gets an item they're choosing from the shop and your name in the record books in the annals of time, and they will not be attributed to another victor at any point in the future. We'll make sure of it. Alrighty, so without further ado, I am going to spin the wheel o' names, our random name picker here, and the Quiller of the Month for the month of November 2025 is Courtney L. Courtney L. Congrats, Courtney, and thank you so much for supporting the program. I think, if I look at my sheet here, Courtney, this is Courtney's first time being Quiller of the Month. So thank you so much, Courtney. Thanks to everybody who continues to support the program. We would not, could not, should not do the program without you. Courtney, keep an eye on your emails, figure out how to claim your winnings, and that'll do it. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jake. Appreciate you as always. And thank you, Quiller Nation, for allowing Jake and I to be a part of your lives every fortnight, for welcoming us into your private spaces with this wonderful super sleuthing that we do together about the greatest literary mystery of all time. Until the next episode, there aren't that many episodes left this year. Only a few. And then, my goodness, season 7 will come to a close and it will be time to begin season 8. If you haven't gone to your favorite podcast streaming site, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple iTunes, wherever it is that you find your podcasts, please do so and give us a rate and or review. I know some streaming services don't allow reviews. They just allow a rating. But if you would, make sure to go to your favorite site, go to multiple sites, and give us a rate and a review. Don't forget, some of those reviews will end up in our anniversary episode at the beginning of January. And also, it helps keep us near the top. So when people do a search for new edutainment, hopefully they find us and join the Quiller Nation. This wonderful community couldn't be possible without all of you helping to share the word regularly. And thank you to those who have introduced the Quiller Nation to new Quillers everywhere. And for those of you who've been loyal Quillers these almost 8 years now, we of course thank you and appreciate you and your loyalty. But there's room for more. So keep spreading the word and keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.